Hello, and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and today's subject, I'm going to talk about relationships that you sort of have to separate yourself from. And generally, when I talk about things and people having misunderstandings, I generally talk about how you can mend fences. But there are times that happen in our lives where these relationships you can't seem to repair them because it definitely takes two people. It's not something that just one person can do all by themselves. And I'm going to really target a love relationship because it's easiest to kind of talk about the dynamics and it's pretty generic. But what happens is when you have a love relationship, it definitely depends on the two parts. Friendships are there because you have things that you have in common, and when it works for you, it works. And if you have separate lives, and that's the thing that's really unique when it comes to friendships, and then girlfriend-boyfriend relationships or same-sex, whatever your partnership is. When you're a friend, you tend to have separate lives and you go back to that. But when you're in a romantic type relationship, there's this sort of interdependence. And it's that part of a relationship that you're constantly in the experience of. You have to nurture that. You're a part of it. And when those things start to break down, when they stop working, then it becomes incumbent upon you to figure out, okay, is this something that is temporary? What have I learned about life? How can I fix this? Or how can I make it better? And if it's something that's not going to work for you, then you have to come to the place where you're able to distance yourself from that relationship. Because here's what tends to happen. When we get into these kinds of relationships where we can't seem to get ourselves out of, then it tends to go on and on and on and on and on. And then your quality of life is actually going to change because you're having to continue to band-aid this sort of thing. And when that happens, then your energy is going into fixing a relationship that maybe it's one of those things that should have just gone away. And you may have tried it over and over, but sometimes we have our own issues, and we keep getting ourselves involved with people that are toxic. And, life will give you the opportunity to do that over and over. And it really becomes important for you to recognize that this is not a good relationship because you really can't necessarily expect the other person to have the courage and the strength to do it. Because sometimes the way these things work is you tend to feed off of each other. But that doesn't mean it's getting better. But if you're just feeding off of each other, you're kind of just spinning your wheels in the mud and you're not going anywhere. And those kinds of situations can go on for longer than you can imagine. And when you have that love component happening, there may be a lot of things that pop up. Maybe you don't want to leave because you have that feeling that you're abandoning someone and that they'll hurt themselves, or you feel like maybe you're abandoning something that you've always wanted because there's parts of the relationship that work. Yeah, those are very seductive things that keep you in bad relationships. Believe it. Those are very seductive. And, some of that may even be coming from the other side because they may be drawing you to try to keep you in a bad relationship when you have to see it for yourself. You really have to be strong in your own right and get to a place where you can be quiet. You can really think about this relationship and whether it's working for you or not. And that can be hard to do for a lot of us. I remember I've had that same problem. And I'm going to illustrate something that was a woman who was very important to me. And when I met her, she embodied a lot of the things that were important to me. She was living on her own. She was independent. She had, was family oriented. She loved to do things. And, we did the normal having conversations. We went out to dinner. I got to learn a little bit about a lot about our life. And, we became very involved, very intertwined. But one of the things that I didn't know early on, but I had some awareness of what to look for. One of the things that happened early on is it turns out she had a bit of a substance abuse problem, and it was mixing medications and alcohol. Well, when I discovered that, my thing was I let her know that, hey, I've seen this, but I was 100% committed to staying with her if she wanted to deal with that issue. And it seemed like early on, she wanted to deal with it. So we tried, some counseling and to really to get her to understand why she was doing it in the first place. And so I felt very committed to trying to work on this. Well, what happened is she sort of got better, and then there was a relapse. But at this point in time, obviously I hadn't ended the relationship because I was still with her. And then I discovered this. And it was more of my being hopeful that this sort of thing would change. It would get better, because I definitely saw that there was a future that I wanted to have with her. And in order for that future to stay in existence, I had to keep talking her into taking care of herself, taking better care of herself. And with that, I really started neglecting my own self. And then what it really boiled down to is she did less and less to stay in the relationship, and I did more and more. So as you can see, this relationship became very stilted. And I talked about that dynamic in another podcast. And when you invest more than the other person is willing to invest, then these things become out of balance, or stilted is another word we like to use. And it tends to fall apart, because in this particular case, I was the one taking all the risk, because it certainly seemed to me that if she wanted to pack up and just end the relationship, she would do it without a whole lot of emotional loss. And I could see that I was the one that was really having the issue with letting go. So what did that teach me? I recalled having that problem all along. I generally had a very difficult time of letting go of people because of that abandonment thing. I've experienced it myself, and I kind of didn't want to put somebody else through that same situation. So if you hear yourself in this circumstance, I know you can relate to all of the other things that followed. So it became very difficult for me to end the relationship. I mean, I tried. I even tried dating other people, and, that seemed to work for a while. And then she seemed to notice that I wasn't around, so she would miss me. She'd give me a call. So she didn't really have to invest much. I mean, it would go a little while before I would hear from her. But there and again, the minute I heard from her, it was like, okay, we were back on again. So we were sort of on again, off again. But see, it started that toxic cycle. And it was in that experience as to where I started to sense some of the losses that I was having, because in her absence, I had actually gone on and had met people who were probably much better for me to be involved with. And, the conversations, the things that I involved myself with, and I wasn't constantly worried about her, you see, and how to Band-Aid that relationship, trying to hold it together, find some sort of containment until the next time it would fall apart. You see, when you're with healthy people, then you tend to work together. You work collaboratively. But when you're with an unhealthy person, they tend to do things constantly that threaten the relationship. And you have to see that. They're not going to point it out to you, because if you're the one that's doing all the work, or you're the one responsible for all the goodness in the relationship, or if you're paying for all the meals out, or the movie tickets, or the vacations, or whatever it is, you got to ask you, why would they ever leave you? They're not. So you have to learn how to see your own value in these situations, and start making decisions, taking responsibility for the relationship and the quality of relationship that you want. And in doing so, things will improve. But it's a journey, and I'm going to talk about that. So I'm going to take a short break here, and we'll be right back.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Hello, welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. And when I left off in that last segment, I was talking about the journey. And the journey that I'm speaking of is I was talking about the story of a relationship, a lady that I had been involved with for some time, and how I continued to Band-Aid that relationship to kind of hold it together. Obviously, I wanted her in my life, but she did less and less to keep the relationship together while she had problems of her own. And as committed and as devoted as I was, it was really taxing me. It had really put me in a place of I was beginning to neglect myself. In fact, I'd done so for quite a while. My own personal business, my own finances, things really started to not be handled. And I began to realize, now I started talking about the journey. Now, this is the journey I was on. I began to spotlight the neglect that I was doing to myself. And you have to see this in those terms. You know, we all are separate vessels, and we have to learn how to take care of ourselves. And when we involve ourselves with someone else, obviously when we have a commitment of for better, for poor, for better or worse, or rich for poor, then yes, we're definitely taking on a lot of responsibilities, and there's a lot of things that we don't necessarily know about because we can't predict the future. But part of the courtship, part of dating someone, is actually learning what this person is going to be like in the long-term relationship. Are they a person that wants to communicate, or are they a person that are they irresponsible? And in the course of the relationship I'm talking about, the person, yeah, she was a nice person. But when it came to the personal responsibility, and even the part of from time to time me being the focus, because she was certainly the focus with all of her issues, and I allowed that. I was part of that. But when I wanted to be the focus, she was no longer around. That was a very painful journey, because what I would have to do to supplement my relationship with her is to go out with other people. Now, when you're in a monogamous relationship, that's not a very cool thing to do, because what that tends to suggest is it's one thing to have friends, but you really can't be going out on dates with somebody else if you have a primary relationship. I mean, that's just not how it's designed to work, because you really do have a commitment, at least a spoken commitment, when you're monogamous and you're in a committed relationship. And I found myself trying to straddle this line. And obviously, it's not a very comfortable place to be, because there's a sense of betrayal that's going to happen. And I can certainly imagine how I would have felt if the shoe were on the other foot. Because remember, I talked about abandonment and what that does to you. And if you can imagine, when you betray someone, the feelings that come up are feelings of abandonment. This is part of what some of the rage is about, because I think we've all had that experience when someone made a promise to us and they didn't keep it, or something like that. And again, if you've had this journey in life, you definitely can relate to this and in the upset. And it's very hard to get past this kind of thing, but you have to do your work on yourself. and go to therapy or whatever it is and get to the bottom of it. And it put me in that place of getting to the bottom of these issues with myself in terms of the abandonment, in terms of the not feeling supported, and in terms of the people that I had picked. Now, before this person I'm talking about, other relationships that I had picked, and I was tending to repeat the process. And I certainly needed to learn to end that cycle because I was going for the cycle again. And those of us that have been in toxic relationships, this type of thing should be very familiar to you. And if it isn't, and the experience, if it isn't already familiar to you, then be forewarned that these are the kinds of things that happen. People become very reliant upon you, and when it comes to them participating in the solution, they have a responsibility because they are part of the problem. They tend to disappear. They tend to leave everything on your lap. You tend to be the fault or the fall guy or woman, and it's a lot of work. But I think you have to look at something else. Consider how you have abandoned yourself in these situations. When you're constantly caretaking someone else and the problems that they bring with them, but you're not taking care of your own self, you're abandoning you. You have to learn how to make yourself a priority without feeling guilty. And this was one of the life's lessons that I began to wake up to, because as much as I felt committed to my partner and her and her needs, when I started to look at my own needs, I mean, I was having to work overtime just to make things right because I wanted to make things special. I was going above and beyond. And it was a very dear friend that pulled me aside and started to help me see everything that was wrong with the situation. And therein lies the value of good friends. Okay, I'm just going to put it there just to say like that. I would have thought with everything that I knew that I had the wisdom to be able to see this on my own, but I didn't. I was blind to it because I was in love with somebody, and we've all been there. You think we think we're doing the right thing, and maybe we feel like that because we've seen somebody else who was very selfless and they were giving of themselves to the extent where they were really putting it all out there. And that's what I wanted to be able to say that I was doing in my relationship. I was giving it 100%. And I think I was also doing it because there was some guilt about having people who wanted me in their life, but I didn't feel the same way about them. So I think I was taking what extra I had from that situation and then applying it here. Okay. So just to add, this person, she cared about me, but it just didn't seem in the cards that it was going to work the way that I had imagined it working. And I had to learn to let go. And this was a troublesome relationship. The letting go part obviously was very, very difficult for me to do because this thing, letting go happens in cycles. And by cycles, I mean, you have the whatever makes you upset, and then you have a little time apart. And then your mind tends to drift back to the good memories, and it sort of rekindles a relationship again. So it picks up, and it goes, and it works. And then whatever fell apart happens again. So it goes for a cycle. And then sometimes this cycle takes less and less time to come back. So let's say the first time you had an upset, it's 6 months ago. And then a month or so later, you have another upset. And then maybe another couple of weeks. So as you can see, the cycle starts to tighten because you begin to do these things and they happen again and again and again. Those are warning flags. Toxic relationships have those cycles. And it's important that you recognize that when it happens and be willing to call a halt to it. Because you can call a halt to it. You can call a timeout on your terms. Say, timeout. We need to go to different corners. We need to stop the madness. Because you may find out there are a lot of people in life that have never had someone who called them on their stuff. There are a lot of people that just think, that, they just get mad and they walk off and they've never really dealt with things. And if you're dealing with that kind of person, how are you going to know until this kind of stuff really comes out? Because people don't just walk up and tell you these kind of things. It's usually something you find out over time. And when you begin to find this out, then you really are going to learn a great deal about yourself, about and if you're paying attention, you'll learn a great deal about yourself, about the kind of choices that you've made. And hopefully it teaches you how to ask better questions, because the questions that you're going to be asking from this point forward are really going to be tantamount to not only this situation, but what you will do in the future should this particular relationship end. And that's what I had to deal with. So I'm going to take a quick break, and then I'm going to wrap this up. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello there, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I am your host, John Johnson, and in this particular podcast, I've been talking about troublesome relationships. And what I've been highlighting here is a particular experience that I had with someone who I was very deeply connected to, and having to live through the experience of the relationship and some of the toxic things that we did, and dealing with the breakup part. Because it was mostly in that phase of it. Because there was never any abuse. There was no fighting or stealing of money or anything like that. There weren't those kind of issues for us to deal with. It was just the emotional part of being very interdependent, being very intertwined. I was very plugged into this woman, and found it very difficult to let go. So when I talked about in the last segment about questions to ask and, getting answers, these were questions that I had to ask of myself, and one of which, as I learned, that I had abandonment issues, which made it very hard on two fronts. One, it made it very hard for me to leave someone who I thought was at least feeding some of the needs that I had, and I was afraid of taking that leap of faith that I could actually find somebody else who would be as or better suited for me. I was very afraid of that, and I had to ask myself, why is that the case? That was one of the questions. And I had to also deal with the fact that, when you end a relationship with someone, you may feel a sense of responsibility for them and how they feel and what happens afterwards. And I get that. Believe me, as a loving person, I get that. And I have never wanted to be someone that left someone in the lurch, so to speak. But I also had to look at that as maybe I was being a bit narcissistic. Maybe I was looking at that from the standpoint as if I'm the only one who could take care of that person. And really, I'm not. I mean, really, when you look at it, they were a person, she was whole before I met her, and she can certainly take care of herself. I mean, remember, she was doing it fairly well without giving much input to the relationship, which is what kind of put me in the situation of having to look at it again and look at the dynamic. So I had to look at it and learn that she was very capable of taking care of herself. And to the point where when she would sense my absence, she made her presence known. But I had to look at it that I didn't just want to be a part-time boyfriend. I wanted something a little more substantial, in that I wasn't going to get it in that relationship. That moment when I realized that if I stopped doing the work, the relationship would end. That was a moment that smacked me and really helped me see how important it is to know my own value, and that my value is not established by somebody else's perception, but I have to look at it from the standpoint of what have I learned? What's my contribution? And while none of us are perfect, and I still have to recognize that I bring value to the relationship, because if I allow someone else to establish what my value is, then I'm always going to be at the mercy of their emotional tantrums. If they feel good today, they'll say something nice. If they don't feel good, then they won't say something nice. And if I'm existing in relationships, hanging on to those crumbs of information, hanging on to something like that, then my esteem is very broken. And that's something that I have to look at repairing. That's something I have to look at fixing. And that could mean a lot of different things. But it's about investing in yourself and not letting somebody else determine your value. So these are some very important lessons for me to learn. It is painful to let go of someone you love. Someone who you saw potential, you saw your future with. Those things are very, very, very difficult to let go of, and it's why it's why it's hard. It's why commitments are supposed to mean something, because when these things break down, then it hurts, and that's to remind us that to do the right thing. Don't create that pain. But in this particular case, it was about me recognizing that my needs weren't being met, and I don't have to try to sell somebody on the idea that I'm a good catch. I just have to acknowledge that if I'm not the person they want, then I need to move on. And that can be, again, one of those moments where you do a gut check, but it's real. And the sooner you learn that, the better off you're going to be. And it doesn't have to be a whole lot of drama around it. We can avoid the drama. Because remember, this wasn't about this big ugly thing that happened. I just figured out our needs weren't being met. And in the end, I think that, and this was the hard part for me, because I'm not used to doing this, because I'm pretty much friends with everybody. I had to break off. I had to say no contact. And that can be a very, very difficult thing to do. I've known people who can do that, and at first I wondered, why they could be so mean and so cruel. But sometimes it has to come to that. I mean, that's the reality of the situation. If being in communication with them is going to hook you back in, I mean, remember, you need to know this about yourself, then you have to not be in communication with them. You have to learn how to take care of yourself. And that's that was part of my journey. I've been talking about troublesome relationships and how to make those transitions. I'm John Johnson. I've been your host for Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. Thank you for listening.